Hi everybody, my name's Sam. I'm head of education at Makers. You come along for a free breakfast here and then this is the price you pay. You have to listen to people like me talk at you. This is going to be about 10 minutes or so, tops, although it might encroach onto 11 if I sort of waffle a little bit. As I said, I'm head of education here. I've been here for about 4 years or so. I don't know a huge amount about building out cultures of learning in businesses like yours, but I do know a little bit about building out cultures of learning in places like this, where we train developers, and I have done some work with places like Santander and Tesco in also hi anyone from Santander or Tesco, in sort of helping build cultures of learning there. And this talk is primarily for tech leads, or lead engineers, or people who are in charge of sort of L&D stuff. And it draws on a background of having trained and placed about 1,500 developers here in the last 4 years. As Ruben said, before that I was a software engineer, and before that I was a teacher, and I focused on educational psychology. So this is kind of a really great gig for me, and I enjoy it. Can I get a little show of hands just before we start, if you are in tech as a tech lead specifically, or as an engineer? Awesome. Okay, great. So there's an audience here. That's good. That's what I wanted to know. Nice. So we're going to talk about 6 key ways to build in learning. We're going to start with context, and then we're going to go ahead onto goals. Third up is going to be tasks, resources, assessment, and feedback. And those are going to be the 6 key areas that we'll focus on while we're here, and hopefully we'll go through reasonably quickly. So let's start with context. In fact, let's always start with context. The idea of context is that if I don't know what I'm doing or why I'm doing it, I'm probably not having a great learning experience. I'm probably blending together all this incoming information in whatever I'm doing with everything else that's happening in my life right now, and it will be easily forgotten. People in general, junior developers especially, are pretty good at heading downwards. That's a thing that they can do nicely. If they're working in a task, then they can figure out how to do it better and better on their own. In fact, it's quite a fun opportunity once you've got the walls in place to drill downwards. But what they struggle to be able to do is to map upwards. And this is where you can really help them when they come to you, which is help them answer questions like, how does this system that I'm building fit with all the other systems in the business? Or where is this work that I'm doing actually happening right now? If you're building, if you're trying to build some sort of deployment system, it can feel like you're just a cog in a massive and unknowable machine, unless you have somebody to help you map that out. And if you can map that out and always return to this context as the start and end point for questions, then you'll be able to understand the system a lot better and understand your own work a lot better, and you'll retain it a lot better. You get a whole lot of learning for free. So a couple of ways in which you can do this include diagramming sessions and just constantly linking things back to the business domain. Your business operates in a domain. There is a user. You have them. But at times, certainly as a junior coming in, if you get a series of discrete and disordered tasks, it can be really hard to connect your work directly to that user and that value. But if you can do so, it's tremendously motivating, tremendously encouraging. So try to map whatever's happening back to that, and always start with context. If I get a student that asks me a question here, then usually I'll try and start with saying, okay, where are we? Let's go to the board and immediately start diagramming to figure out the map of the lie of the land. So that's context. Let's talk about goals. So goals are all about asking, and we'll talk about it in the context of a theory by a guy called Edwin Locke from the 1960s. Really, really great short article and paper about goals. We have this word goal that we use a whole bunch in society, but it has a lot of sort of formal meaning around it that's pretty helpful, and we've structured our entire system here around the idea of goals. And these are basically cashed down to, what can I say about myself? What are some statements that I can make true about myself? And in an ideal world, these statements are really specific. They are, I can do this, or I can do that. They're aspirational, so they're not necessarily held to, I can use this particular JavaScript framework. They're more things like, I can use JavaScript to do anything, that sort of thing. They're expected, so we hold our expectations at that goal level, and we just assume that people will be meeting them. And they're believed. We believe in the people that that are trying to achieve those goals. There's just a kind of base underlying assumption that people are going to hit those at some point, and that's how that will work. So when trying to formulate goals, try to think maybe quarterly or halfly ahead and think, okay, what should somebody be able to say about themselves in 6 months? And keep those aspirations really, really high. Expect that people will be able to achieve it and believe them. And we'll talk a little bit more about how expectations come together with achievement. There is nothing in education that is correlated with achievement like the expectation of somebody who is a learned mentor or peer. This is well borne out in a really fantastic paper called Pygmalion in the Classroom. Really, really recommended. But it talks about the effects of having observation and the effects of having somebody that you respect. Expect that you will achieve very, very highly. And those things tend to work out being true. So keep those expectations high and believe that people will believe them. Set aspirational and specific goals, and you have done half the work. Cool. So that's context and goals. Let's talk about tasks. These are the meat. This is the main thing that people will be doing while they're learning in their environment. And the good news is that you don't need to spend loads of time designing specific learning tasks. It's sort of all been done before, and also you sort of get it for free because everything that you do is an exercise. Everything can be a learning event with just a few trimmings put around the edge. What you want to give people when they are trying to complete a task is adequate time to do it, but not too much. Keep it tight so that they feel a little bit of pressure around it. A minimal sense of unblocking. Your role is not there to demonstrate how to do the task and then get them to do it. Boring as hell. If you can imagine back to math classes when someone would write something out on the board and then you do that 70 times, just awful, awful experience. So you're there to try and help people get unstuck a little bit, and then off they go to whatever other hell they're moving on to. Minimal unblocking. Keywords. You know the words and the terminology from this domain way better than somebody who's new at this field is going to. Or if they know some words, they probably won't know much about it. So try and drop them in. While you're doing this particular thing, while you're working on this ticket, you might want to look up the word Docker. You might want to look up the idea of containerization. And you might want to think about what you're doing within that context. And that way people will start to be able to give names to things, and once we have words to describe activities, we become way, way more powerful. And feeling powerful makes us feel more motivated, which helps us to achieve goals. So it's all sort of tied together in that respect. And the last thing is encouragement. People will be able to achieve incredible things if you maintain your expectations high and you encourage them to be able to do things. They don't necessarily need as much help as you need, but what they do need is motivation. That's your fuel in the tank. Let's talk about resources, which is what people use while they're completing tasks. These are the things that help them to be able to do that. You are their number one resource. You can think of yourself as a book on a shelf that writes itself. So they can pull on you and get an answer to stuff whenever they want it. There are other things that you can also do. Reading is something that's very good, and people new to a field tend to read profusely within that field if they're motivated to get good at it. It's just most of the reading that they'll do is not particularly high impact. But you, as an expert within this field, can identify things that are high impact or low impact. And if someone comes to you with a question, it's really great to be able to say, read this article on this. I'm not going to talk to you about it until you've read this article on this. And people will then be able to pick that up. Don't give people entire books because, it's just, I just wanted to know how to, get Kubernetes up in the cloud. But give them articles. Find something and sort of finesse it. You don't need to write them from scratch. That would be a pain. And you'll sort of build a library as you go along, which you can use in any situation with anybody else ever again in the future. And prep exercises. And I know I said earlier that you don't have to design exercises from scratch, but sometimes you might be doing a bit of a ticket and think, this is maybe something that I could use with somebody. Maybe I could pull out a little bit of this and take out some of the business-specific logic, and here's a little exercise in doing X, Y, Z. And if they're struggling with X, Y, or Z, then maybe I can just give them this little bit of this ticket that I'm working on. So having something ticking at the back of your head thinking, God, this is like a classic case of when I do this. This is a classic case of scaffolding up a controller in Rails. Then, boom. Grab that, make that an exercise, and say, oh, it looks like you're trying to build out a controller in Rails. Here's a little prep exercise that you can use. So you reading and prep exercises. And be Socratic in the way that you do stuff. Please don't do it like I'm doing it here, which is kind of just this awful one-way diatribe. But instead, try to field questions. Being Socratic comes down to, we have a saying at Makers, which is coaches always talk in questions. And that's a kind of simple mantra to go with, which is there some way that I can express this as a question? And if you keep that in your mind, then you get really, really better at it, and you sort of sound super wise. Even though you may not actually have a clue what you're talking about. It's brilliant. Actually, Evgeny doesn't know this. He's our CEO at Makers, but I completely fudged our interview in the first, when I joined Makers about 4 and a bit years ago. Because there was some guy working on something I'd never seen before, and I just asked him questions about it because I didn't know. And he managed to unblock himself, and he thought that was the greatest learning experience, and Evgeny was reasonably impressed, so I got a job. Yeah, so don't look too hard, but be Socratic. It's really, really great. Something I think about is what's the model of reality they have in their heads right now? What's the next most complicated model they should have after this one? Where are they at right now, and how can I figure out what they understand and what they don't understand? And then what's the level beyond that? And how can I question them to get between those two? Diagramming is really, really useful here because you can start linking together concepts in an abstract way, and it all comes back to context. So be Socratic about stuff. Ask questions, build a library, and keep that Socratic questioning focus. Keep it nice and tight. Nobody wants to come and ask a question and then get a 2-hour demonstration of how to do X, Y, or Z. Keep it tight. Ask the minimal thing that's required to get people unblocked. And avoid tutorials like the plague, please. Tutorials are the GCSEs of learning. They are just, I will learn to do this specific thing in this specific context and never anywhere else ever again. They can give you a great boost. You can feel pretty good after having done a tutorial, but that's pretty much as far as it goes. I am yet to find any decent tutorials which will generalize across a number of different places. In order to learn stuff, you just have to work at it the hard way. So, avoid tutorials. Okay, coming through to the last couple of bits, which is sort of how we know that learning has happened and what we do after that. Let's talk about assessment. And the idea of assessment is to figure out how people are doing. And I split assessment down into 4 areas here at Makers, which is concretes, concepts, skills, and behaviors. And each of these means a slightly different thing and should be assessed in a slightly different way. Concretes we're not going to care too much about. This is things like, how do I use this specific syntax to achieve this particular task? This is the bread and butter of which you will have many thousands in your head as you're programming on a daily basis. But it's not really that useful to assess at that level because they're mostly stuff that can be looked up in about 10 seconds on Google. In fact, multiple times a day I'll look out how to substitute strings in my given language because, and I can see some devs nodding in the audience, it seems like an incredibly useful thing, but honestly, when it's 5 seconds away on Google, why am I going to keep space in my working memory for that? So concretes are not really worth assessing at. Concepts, however, are pretty good. This is how people understand things. Do they get HTTP? Do they understand the idea of functions? And there are some ways to get at those. Skills, these are really good. These are in practice. This is, can they build this thing? Can they do this stuff? The vast majority of learning and assessment here at Makers is at the level of skills and some concepts. And then there's behaviors, which is how they comport themselves. Are they being a wise and thoughtful and helpful developer and teammate? Are those things that they care about? So if you want to find out about how people are doing at concepts, ask them. Ask them what HTTP is. Ask them how a web app works. Get them up to a whiteboard and get them to diagram it out. And then get them to show you the context within your particular organization so that they constantly have that overhead. If you want to know about skills, observe them. Ask them to do something small or a sub-ticket that you've done before, and see how they go about it. Focus mostly on their process. If they're the opposite of a process is flailing around, so if you can see them trying random things, then that's the point at which you can say, okay, look, now we're here and clearly you've run out of process, so let's work on this skill that you can develop. So those are the main areas that you'd assess around. Behaviors are probably the sort of thing you figure out in performance reviews and over cups of coffee and in retros and finding out who people are. But concepts and skills are the main areas that you want to focus your assessment. Okay, last part, let's talk about feedback. So feedback is often in a very formal setting, particularly within larger corporate organizations. Feedback is a thing that happens in 360 performance reviews and like nary a word spoken between. But of course, in real life, feedback is what reality gives us in order to figure out whether or not we did something well or didn't do something well. And so therefore, try and have a structure for actually building it in. Even if it's a loose one, a cup of coffee once a week is fine. Retros and stand-ups are there. In fact, use the authentic tools that you already use in your daily life for telling people if they've done stuff right or wrong to build in feedback. Here at Makers, we use pull requests liberally, and we have code review sessions, and we have stand-ups, and we have retros, and these are all forms of feedback structure. And sometimes we'll see people stopping a stand-up, the students organize them themselves, will stop a stand-up, and they'll say, okay, right, now it's feedback time for everybody, and everyone's got to come up with something that they're going to say to each other. And over time, you refine it, and you get a little bit better. But there's also a way of being too blasé with feedback. You can just dump a whole like pint of code on people and say, right, just find out what this is. Tell me feedback about this. So what you want to do is you want to ask people to give you feedback in clever ways. The three things that I come back to are requiring intentionality. So if somebody asks you for feedback, don't give it to them unless they've asked you expressly, scoped it. What is the feedback that I want? Because this will require them to be more intentional and figure out what it is that they're actually trying to do with that feedback. So requiring intentionality. Keep it tight. Give your feedback in as short a way as possible. It's tempting to give feedback on everything and the moon at the same time, but then only a small amount of that will be retained. If you ask them to be intentional, they scope it, and just give them feedback in that particular area, then it will help them to realize that they are the masters of their own destiny. So keep things tight. And the last thing is demand iteration. Make sure that when you've offered some feedback, you want to see the thing that you just gave feedback on again. It might seem crazy to say, oh, but they'd be doing twice as much work. But there is so much more learning to be juiced from doing the same thing twice than there is from doing one thing and then it's gone into the ether forever. So there we go. Those are the 6 things that I focus on. Context, goals, task, resources, assessment, and feedback. There is a handout which will be available, which is like this thing basically, but in the paper. You can use it to, I don't know, look at or think about or stuff. And do we have any time for questions, or did I just radically run over time? 5 minutes for questions. 5 minutes for questions. Amazing. Thank you so much, everybody. Nice. Yeah. So I'll give like a couple of seconds just to think about stuff, and then go for questions. Neato. And if you wouldn't mind saying your name, just so I know who I'm talking to.
Kerry.
Kerry. Thank you, Kerry.
I was just wondering exactly what you meant by tutorials. Do you mean the kind of online, I don't know, assessments and little tasks you can do, or do you mean something more personal, one-to-one kind of thing?
Oh, totally good question, because yeah, if you went to one of the Oxbridge universities or something, then a tutorial will mean something quite different, which is actually pretty good, an interactive experience. No, I mean mostly blog posts is what you get for tutorials, which is, and they're always at the level of concretes. There are some which are different, but the vast majority are very concrete. And they're things like if you search into Google how to do XYZ in JavaScript, there'll be the first 5 answers, Medium posts saying how to build a React component in JavaScript. You can follow it through, you can type the code as you go, you can copy paste it, and well done, you built a React component in JavaScript, and you can never do it again. So that's what I mean by tutorials. No worries. Yes, take it away.
Mention context. Context can be massive.
Yeah.
How do you get the indicators that you've given enough context to get people out of the starting points?
Yeah, great question. So the question is, context can be absolutely massive. How do you get indicators that you've given the right amount of context to an individual? Is that roughly right? Nice. It's a super good question. And I would come down to what you're essentially trying to do with context is provide a map of where you're at for anything. There's a really good book about mapping and maps. I said not to recommend entire books, but just the opening chapter of this book is really good. It's called Seeing Like a State, and it talks about the concept of mapping and in a slightly roundabout way. It's very relevant to software engineering, I think. The question as to how you know that you've given somebody enough is, I think, when you know that you're at the right layer of abstraction or not. I would tend to start when mapping out context for a system at the highest possible level. What are the largest components in here, and limit my number. Let's say we're going to say 6. And how do they interact? And then I will start progressively zooming in, a little bit like how Google Maps will give you borders of countries and then as you zoom in, roads. At different levels of abstraction, you can have differing degrees of detail, and you want to be able to take it, in an ideal world, all the way from a picture of the whole system, the whole globe, right down to a single address, right down to the code that's being written right now, so that people can see how the cogs that they're inserting into the machine will roughly affect the structure overall. Of course, that means there are many other areas you don't need to dive into. I don't really need to know much about roads in Nicaragua if all I'm trying to do is find my way to the Hoxton here. But it does mean that I can get a tremendous level of detail at the same time as getting a tremendous level of abstraction. And being able to zoom up and down those layers is the skill that we're looking for with context building. Does that give a... Awesome, no worries. Great. OK, no more. Love that feedback. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great day.